Most of us must be familiar with the division of human development into the three ages: the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age. This was simply a convenient method devised by a 19th century Danish museum curator as an aid to the classification of his collections. But it has endured for over 150 years, despite repeated attempts to undermine it. Its validity lies to a very large extent in the nature of the materials themselves. Stone is the most durable of the materials available to early tool makers, but we often tend to forget that they also had such materials as wood, bone and shell to work with. All these materials are plentiful in nature, but they are lacking in certain fundamental properties which impose limitations on their use. It was probably inevitable that man would discover the use of metal sometime. But metals as such are not commonly found in nature. Small nuggets of copper ore are still to be found occasionally on the surface in the Near East, and these were doubtless more plentiful in antiquity. We know that this native copper was certainly in use by man as early as 9 to 7,000 years BC, and no doubt the Neolithic men who used it were impressed by the superior qualities of what they must have thought of as a special type of stone that they'd picked up and were able to shape. Gold, too, was known from this earlier period, but its greater rarity and its softness meant that it was unsuitable for making tools or weapons, and it has always been treated as a precious metal, used for ornament and decoration. The same considerations apply equally to silver. Copper was infinitely more significant to early man. The overwhelming majority of the metals in the Earth's crust are in the form of ores, that is to say, combined with other elements in a mineral form. Metal can only be released from them as a result of quite complex technological processing. How then did prehistoric man become aware of metal ores? Dr. Andrew Sherratt of the Ashmolean Museum, Oxford.
The development of copper metallurgy is very much related to the distribution of copper ores themselves. And if you look at a map of where copper ores occur, then you see that they occupy the great mountain chain going all the way from Iran round through Turkey into southeast Europe, the Balkan and Carpathian mountains, going through the Alps and of course including Spain in the west. Now, all of these areas have certain features geologically in common with each other and contrast with the areas to the north, which are by and large rather different. They are old mountain routes, which have a rather different set of minerals, in which, for instance, tin is much more common. It's rather rare in southern Europe. Now, as well as the distribution of the copper ores, the primary ores, another important effect is the degree of weathering that they've undergone. Now, this weathering tends to create a crust of secondary minerals, which may be up to 20 meters in depth. Where the ores outcrop at the surface, there are often very evident traces. The minerals that occur in the secondary zone are often very attractive, things like azurite, malachite, stones which were attractive in themselves and were often widely traded before it was realized that they were in fact copper ores. So already right at the beginning of the post-glacial, around 10,000 or so years ago, in the Near East, there were quite widespread trading networks carrying supplies from Anatolia down into Iran and down into Palestine over surprisingly long distances.
The distribution of copper ores in the Near East, in Anatolia and Iran, is of course highly significant in many ways. These are just those areas where the Neolithic Revolution took place. And here too the ancestors of modern animals and cereals were first domesticated at the beginning of the post-glacial period. But when did the production of metal from its ores, the process known as smelting, begin in the Near East?
Native copper, occurring in a naturally pure form, can of course be exploited straight away. It can be exploited just by hammering. And in fact in North America, where there are extensive lodes of native copper in the Great Lakes area, this was the only use that copper was ever put to. It never developed beyond the stage of simply hammering native copper. And this kind of use can be traced a long way back in the archaeological record. At Çatalhöyük, for instance, at Çayönü, famous sites in the early history of agriculture, back to 5, 6, 7,000 or so BC, there are small lumps of hammered native copper. But this is very different from smelting the ores, actually chemically separating the copper from the other constituents of the ores, and this kind of use only goes back to 4 or 5,000 BC. And the sites which are important here are, for instance, Janasan in central Anatolia, where from about 5000 BC we have a shaft-hole mace head, quite a solid object, about 3 inches high, which was very probably made from smelted copper. But much less ambiguous evidence from around 4000 BC comes from the site of Tali Iblis in southern Iran, where the whole settlement has produced evidence of smelting hearths, crucibles, slag, and evidence of malachite ore. So certainly by 4000, and probably as far back as 5000, we've got true smelting taking place in different parts of the Near East.
We shall probably never know exactly where this great imaginative invention took place or how it happened. Various theories have been put forward to explain how it actually came about. Some scholars see smelting as an extension and adaptation of the process of pottery manufacture. The high temperatures needed to produce stoneware, over 1000 degrees Celsius, would be enough under the right conditions to smelt any copper ore inside the kiln or forming part of its structure. Equally feasible, however, is the so-called campfire theory, which suggests that a hearth built of blocks of copper ore could be accidentally smelted and produce metal under certain circumstances. In either case, the result would be small particles of metallic copper, which would be identifiable with the special stone with unusual properties already known to early man in its native form. My own preference is rather for the campfire theory, in view of the evidence we now have of the shapes of early smelting furnaces, which are much more reminiscent of hearths than they are of pottery kilns, which had evolved into a specialized form by the period we're talking about. We're fortunate in now having available for study and comparison some copper smelting furnaces recently discovered at Timna on the Sinai Peninsula that can be dated back to a very early stage in the story of metal smelting. The excavator was Dr. Benno Rothenberg of the London-based Institute of Archaeometallurgical Studies.
We have sorted out, at least tentatively, the early stages of copper making, beginning with the Chalcolithic period, meaning the 4th millennium, when in a quite primitive way copper was mined. In fact, it was more a collecting of copper nodules and then taken to a small smelting site outside the Timna Valley. So on a little hill, well, in fact, it's no more than about 30 feet high, we found some slags. There was no building, no nothing. In fact, no remains of structures, just tiny little broken pieces of slag, which looked very odd to me because they were like nothing I had seen before. And there was one stone, which I noticed is a sandstone, and nobody would bring a stone of that size to up a hill unless he needs it for some purpose. Now, sandstone is a very good refractory. So I said, here might be our furnace. And we excavated 1 square meter around that stone and right into the furnace. In fact, it was a hole in the ground about 40 centimeters across, about 40 to 50 centimeters deep, with a small superstructure of small stones, and this was the furnace. And the smelting process was in fact relatively simple. The ore available was malachite. They crushed it to, I would say, the size of a pea, and threw it into the furnace. The furnace was heated with charcoal fire. They must have used a bellows or two, and reached a temperature of 1200 degrees Celsius. And the moment the ore got into the furnace, got up to 700 or 800 degrees, it would reduce to metallic copper and form little pellets and frills and droplets. The droplets would tend to sink, but the slag that formed from the remaining sand, silica, the rock, and the ashes of the charcoal would entrap the little drops, and so the furnace would fill with a big mass of slag, with a great number of small metal prills in the slag. I'm not so sure whether an ingot was formed below. Maybe some of the copper managed to get to the bottom and kind of accumulate into a small copper ingot or copper cake. And then the smelter would leave the furnace and let it get cold. Remove the slag, crush it, break it up to free the entrapped copper. And this would be your very early copper smelting.
That, of course, was pure copper, the earliest metal used by man. But pure copper is not a particularly useful material in the technological sense. Andrew Sherritt again.
Early copper objects tended to be used primarily for prestige objects, and only secondarily for tools. There certainly were areas where copper would have been perhaps as cheap in terms of the effort needed to acquire it as flint would have been, for instance. There are certain sites where copper sources are immediately adjacent and flint sources are a long way away. And in circumstances like that, early copper tools would have been economically useful. But it certainly wasn't a breakthrough. I think in general one can say that until the Middle or Late Bronze Age, copper had no direct technological influence on man's ability to alter and affect his environment. So we've got a period of thousands of years, the formative period of copper metallurgy, in which it was really a novelty. It was producing primarily prestige objects, objects that people would like to be seen carrying around, or that were symbols of authority, or that would adorn temples, for instance. And it was only later on in the Bronze Age that copper, by then bronze, came to be used extensively as part of a working technology.
Bronze is an alloy of copper and tin, and in every way it is superior to pure copper as a material for tools and weapons. It's easier to cast, and it can be made very hard and strong by suitable hammering and heating. The discovery of alloying, the mixing of two metals together, may well have been accidental. The earliest alloys of copper are not with tin, but with arsenic. This may seem surprising, but in fact arsenic frequently occurs as a constituent of copper ores. The mixture of arsenical and non-arsenical ores would result in a significantly better end product after smelting, and would almost certainly have set in train a purely empirical quest for other types of mineral to mix with the copper ores, in the hope of upgrading the end product still further. At some time, somewhere, someone lighted upon tin ore and tried it out, and true bronze became available to early man. Now, tin ores are rare, much rarer than copper ores, and the recognition of their special quality resulted in widespread prospecting for ores and the opening up of trade routes as far north as Cornwall, a development which had a profound effect on the expansion of the civilized world and consequent cultural interchanges.